Today, Down the Rabbit Hole, an election special. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, where the latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Well, get your tin hat out because I've got my friend George here and we're going to talk about the election. Hi, George.
Hello, Martin.
We thought it would be good to just have a little bit of a freewheeling conversation about the election, which of course has now been called. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to get into it, but my perspective is this, and I'll see what you think about it. Mm-hmm. But we've basically got two parties who are in a bit of a phony war with each other, right? Because they always sort of throw rocks at each other, etc., etc. But when you actually stand back and listen to them and look at their policies, they're about 95% the same.
Yep.
So they're really just fighting over very small things. And in fact, mostly it doesn't make much difference which side of politics you get back in because they'll be dancing the same tune anyway. Which raises the first interesting question, which is, well, is there any difference? And the other interesting observation is that the election really comes down to about 8 or 10 seats. So most of the power guys will be dropping into, the seats in Tasmania or Queensland or wherever. But most of the rest of the electorates hardly ever get a visit. They certainly don't get any money at election time. And so actually the whole concept of democracy seems to me to be going off the rails as well, insofar that actually the decisions ultimately will be made by just a few people in just a few electorates. So I don't know.
I tend to agree with what you've just said there, Martin. So interesting, I think if we go back to the original idea of democracy that came out of Greece, because that's where democracy started, it wasn't designed the way it's working now, because democracy in its original concept actually worked from the bottom up, not from the top down. And today it seems to work from the top down. And yes, you're right, I agree that the two parties don't seem to have much difference in their policies anymore. You kind of think, well, what happened there? And now, of course, they've got the money as well, because they've got all the backing of things like corporations and unions, etc. And the minor parties have to really go out and fund their own campaigns. So I think the minor parties are going to gain in this particular election. And the reason I think that's going to happen is people have seen things from both parties they don't like. And let's face it, I mean, when the Liberal Party got in after Turnbull-Morrison turned to Morrison-Frydenberg, when they got in 2019. And seriously, I thought, if I was going to make a prediction of what they were going to do next, I thought they're going to go on a big spending spree. Of course, along comes COVID, the perfect excuse, and now they are taking out, $1 trillion in debt, which normally the Liberal Party is not for public spending but for private spending. The Labor Party is for public spending, not private spending. And the two play political football with a hot potato here. But it seems one thing that is for sure, either of those two policies do one thing in common. They increase the debt. Would you agree there, Martin?
Well, of course, if you look at the statistics on debt, then, the public sector debt has gone through the roof. As you say, it'll be $1 trillion plus. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the worrying observation there is that interest rates, which have been very low, look like they're rising. So the cost of that debt's going to rise, in the years ahead. So that's a problem. But also you've got private sector debt. And the other factor that both sides of politics have powered over the last 20, 30 years is to basically drive the private sector, individuals and households as well as businesses, but particularly households and particularly mortgages, to basically get more and more debt, to the point that the debt to income ratios are pretty much as high as they've ever been. And the amount of debt in the system in Australia, particularly around mortgages, is a lot higher than almost any other country in the world. And of course, that's led to very, very strong house price growth. So there is a commonality of policy on that issue that's been in place for at least 20, maybe 30 years. The other interesting observation, though, is that if you actually listen carefully to what the parties are saying at the moment, it's actually almost a content-free election campaign, because there's almost very little that they actually really are going to campaign on. They're throwing rocks at each other, right?
Yeah.
And, I'm the macroeconomic manager, and he doesn't know what he's talking about, and he doesn't know what the the bank rate is or the unemployment rate is.
I think that's only going to play into the hands of the minor parties, because the electorate, first of all, a couple of things. You mentioned mortgage stress is on the rise.
Yep.
And people are actually looking at their policies and beginning to wonder whether or not they're good economic managers of the country. And I know you're laughing.
Well, they keep saying they are, so it must be true, right?
It depends on where you're situated in the economy. If you think about it, Australia does have a good economy. It's very strong. It's just that it's not filtering down to the mums and dads and the small businesses. It seems to be going all the way to the top. So other parties now have an opportunity to try and address this issue. And I think the UAP are considering putting a 15% tax on exports of steel. And they claim that will fix the deficit, which I'm a big believer in, fixing the deficit. I have no problem with having debt if the debt increases the gross domestic product and increases the standards of living. But look, if you buy a house, and now we're getting into the media here, they're talking about investing. And if you buy a house and you see the house price rising and rising as it has, well, that's a good investment because you're getting a return on investment. Do you notice that word return, Martin? It's a bit like having a stock that costs you more and more to keep as it's rising, but it doesn't give you a PE ratio. And so the more expensive it becomes and the more inflation kicks in, the more it's becoming a burden on the person who buys the home. Even though they can say, my home went up $100,000 last year, I don't even earn that much money. Does this sound like a strong economy to you? I mean, somebody tell me I'm wrong here. But I have no problem with investing in property because I think that ultimately people have to put their money somewhere. And often, where do they go? They go into real estate. But you've got to be able to service the debt, and that real estate has to be able to extract rent from the real economy and then bring it back to the person who's made the investment on the property. Not to mention he's got to maintain the property, and not to mention they take the risk, and if the economy falls over, well, these issues that we have now, I think a lot of the voters are starting to think, well, just what sort of economic management do we have? And what sort of future do we have in terms of maintaining our standards of living and not slipping into poverty? Now, I'd like to turn it over to you, Martin. What do you think of what I've just said there?
There's a few things to unpack there. The first is, you could argue that property prices have been rising, or you could alternatively argue that the value or the worth of each individual dollar is actually falling. So you need more dollars to basically grab the same thing that you bought last year. That's, of course, the definition of inflation, right?
Yes.
And so actually, could it be that really we're no further forward? It's just we've got a bigger number because effectively the value of each individual dollar has been reduced year after year after year after year.
Yep.
And so that while on paper it sounds good and looks good, in practice it actually is meaningless, right? It's not real wealth.
I'd agree with that, and I think you could go back and cite the Japanese miracle in the late 80s when they had the booming real estate prices and their economy was booming. Of course, it got to such dizzy heights. I think at one stage Tokyo was actually of the same value as the whole of the US property market, Tokyo. Yep. That's how far it went up. And of course, that's not sustainable. It's a bubble. And when it did crash, just exactly who did take over all those debts and who was the beneficiary of the Japanese model, I think you'll find it was the Japanese central bank that actually benefited there. But the average citizen didn't. And that to me comes across as predatory lending and predatory economics. I think, is that a term that you use, Martin?
Well, certainly if you look at the Bank of Japan, they own more of the Japanese economy than pretty much any central bank around the world because they've been basically doing quantitative easing for year after year after year to try and support the economy. And as you rightly say, property prices in Japan went through a very high level and then has come back and they're not anywhere near as where they were. The point I was trying to make, though, was that in a way, the dollar sign and the dollar value for a property is illusory. It actually is meaningless until you actually know what the value of money actually is, or the value of your dollars are. But inflating property prices or devaluing dollars is not about laying a long-term foundation for a future economy where we're seeing greater momentum, greater jobs growth, greater wages growth, all those things, greater manufacturing locally rather than internationally. And in fact, as I think I may have said on a previous conversation with you, if you look at the economic complexity of Australia, it's much, much more diminished than almost any other Western economy. We've basically got quite a lot of commodities at the moment, a lot of housing, and not much else. And none of it is really actually designing to build growth and prosperity for the future. So we're living off effectively an old business model, a business model that is basically driven by digging stuff out of the ground and selling it overseas, and then building lots of houses and getting people to buy ever more property and using the value of the inflated property to inflate the value of the banks and the wealth effects, etc., etc. So we've got a very artificial economy at the moment. And the problem with all of this is that if you're in the right segment of the population base and you're actually able to enjoy the momentum of stock markets rising or property prices rising, or you're able to save the 250 billion or whatever the number was that was thrown into the economy, you'll be feeling quite happy and quite wealthy, and things are all very good. But the interesting question is, well, what proportion of people are actually in that boat? And what about the proportion of people who aren't, who actually see their real wages going backwards, who actually can't get into the property market, can't get anywhere to rent because rents are going through the roof, and are in a sector of the economy potentially where their future jobs are at risk? And at the moment, we've got more people, I think, in that bucket than we've got in the booming bucket, as it were. And that's a problem.
Look, I agree. And here's the point. You know that you're in statistics, and now we're getting into the media. And we remember we were possibly talking about the media. Now, the media have a huge impact in all of this because the public are reliant on the media to be factual, to give the correct statistics. Now, you do statistics, and the media claiming very low unemployment as if it's a fantastic thing. And they keep talking about the economy being strong. They do challenge the Liberal Party on that deficit. And of course, these politicians have got what I call silver tongues. They know how to come back. And I've been involved in media myself, so I've seen the inner workings of media. I've actually worked behind the scenes. Of course, it is possible because of the compartmentalisation of the way industry works, to work in an industry and not really know what's happening at the top. This is fairly normal. The media claiming very low inflation figures, and I think that you probably would look at those inflation figures and say, well, of course, if they're structuring the way they relate to inflation through the way the figures are structured, so they might ignore property as part of the inflation figure, and so they manipulate the figures and then say, here's your inflation figure, it's very low. And the mums and dads and people in business are going, I don't know what planet they're on, because that's not what I see. It looks to me like Labor has the upper hand to get in as a government, but I actually think we might see the minor parties actually come in and tip the balance of power, which might leave Labor and Liberal in a bit of a dilemma. Now, here's an interesting thing. Seeing as they're both very similar in their policies, would it surprise you if they turned around and said, you know what, we've got an emergency situation, the country's in a very bad way, we have to bring the two major parties together and form a government, seeing as they're the same anyhow. Do you know what I'm saying? Now, would that surprise you? Wouldn't surprise me.
National government of but you see that's against the Westminster system, right? So the Westminster system is designed to basically create this false dichotomy between two positions, right? So that they can throw rocks at each other, and whoever is in power, then the other guys throw rocks and try and get back. you've got to ask yourself whether that is actually a constructive model. And by the way, your point earlier on about democracy from the bottom up, that, of course, exactly was how it was originally conceived. Have you never thought that with the internet and with the ability for people to connect directly, we could have a different model where effectively everybody takes a vote on all of the policies bottom up every time? Why do we need these representatives who don't represent us making all the decisions on, quote, our behalf?
And now we're getting a bit controversial here. But then again, we are down the rabbit hole, so what the hell? Let's get controversial.
Let's go there.
Okay, so look, I'm going to make this prediction. When we won Second World War, okay, Germany lost the war. Let's say the Nazis, Germany, lost the war. America then became the new superpower, the new top dog on the street. Bretton Woods gave them the US dollar as the reserve currency, which we know about. But you know what I think? I think that the Nazi Party didn't lose the war. I think what happened was the Nazi Party shifted from Germany and shipped itself all the way over to the US and continued its operation. That's an extreme sort of statement. I can see a puzzled look on your face there.
Okay.
Now I'll add one thing.
Yeah.
Have a look at the eagle, the two-winged bird, the left and the right of policy. And what do you have in the middle? What we were saying just a moment ago? The same bird, the same policy. There's not a lot of difference. If the two parties are very similar and have a path that they want to go down, very similar path, well, we end up with a party with very similar long-term interests. And I can tell you the one thing that drives these two parties together is they're consistent in increasing debt over the nation, whether it's private or public.
Yep.
That's what I see. I think you probably see that yourself. And I actually mentioned this to a friend of mine who was very sceptical, and I said to him, the two parties are the same. And he said, how so? And I said, well, why don't you have a look at the way they constantly find ways to increase debt in the country, whether it's private or public. Now, some people would say, well, what's wrong with increasing debt? And you think, well, if you increase debt and you start to create jobs and construction and you start to create exports, fine. But what are we doing? We're creating an internal economy reliant on external forces all the time to continue to run itself. I don't see that as a sustainable model. I don't know what you think, Martin.
Well, look, the point is, the modern monetary theory of comes into play here, right? And that is basically you can't think of the government balance sheet the same way as a household balance sheet. In other words, it doesn't matter if, in fact, a government runs deficits. But I'd caveat that it depends what they do with the money, right? If they actually are investing that money into things that are actually going to be long-term productive and actually take the economy into a better place in the long term, then it makes sense to do it. But if what you're doing is basically ramping up the debt so that you can pay big amount of JobKeeper to businesses who never needed it, or bail out companies that didn't need it, or even build car parks for commuters that perhaps weren't needed. So it comes down to what is the debt for, right?
Agreed.
And the problem we have at the moment is, and as you said earlier on, the incumbents have actually increased the amount of debt, and they'll blame the COVID crisis. But by the way, the debt was already rising before COVID. They then accelerated the debt further. But how much of that increased debt has led to a more productive economy? How much of that debt has actually been invested in the long-term future of Australia? I would say not a lot.
The fact of the matter is it's just a convenient excuse that COVID comes along and the government's got a great opportunity to seize into getting onto the idea of creating a massive debt on the country to say they're saving the economy. But the economy doesn't look that good internally and on the main street of Australia. But if you look at countries like, how many times have we ever looked at Africans and probably turned a blind eye and said, oh yes, look, the Africans. I mean, I don't know what Australians know about Africans, but I think they tend to kind of be more worried about their day-to-day activities. And when they see Africans that are starving or whatever, or worse off than us, you get comments like, oh, aren't we so lucky to live in Australia? We don't have to deal with situations where we don't have enough food, etc. But I'm going to make this controversial statement now, please drum roll now. There we are, drum roll. That I think Australia is going down the path of a third world nation. And I'll give you the similarity. Those African nations that we see where people, they don't have enough to eat and they plaster them in front of us on TV, the citizens in Australia would look at that and many of them might say, oh, that's terrible. And quite a few would probably contribute to help them. The point is, when your economy has resources and then you look at the citizens and you look at them, they're poor, but they've got resources. Well, something clearly is not right here, because if the country's a rich country, how come this doesn't trickle down to the main street economy? How come we don't see their citizens having a better life? And I think Australia is going through a similar process to what happens in those African nations. I think we've got resources here, and the powers that be at the top want to pay as little tax and make as much profit as possible. We'll call it the neoliberal model. Now, the politicians are starting to get to the end game where people are starting to ask questions, and they're saying just exactly what's going on in Australia, because a lot of people are actually quite disgruntled. There was a man that actually went up to Scott Morrison and said, didn't you say if you have a go, you get a go? And Scott Morrison was really stuck on that one. Did you see the piece? And I just think this is the result of where Australia is going. And if we don't start to find ways to reduce the debt or turn that debt into productivity so that we can increase the standards of living, I really think that people are going to say, well, enough of these two clowns. We're going to start to look at the alternative parties. And I think this time around in this federal election, I think you can expect to see the minor parties pick up seats. They might not pick up a lot, but I really think that they are going to pick them up. And I wouldn't be surprised if both Labor and Liberal end up with a hung parliament and then have to make a decision. Are they going to join with a minor party, or are they going to even join forces? Now, would it surprise you if Labor and Liberal actually joined forces and used the excuse, we're at a terrible time in Australia right now, the economy's in a bad way, thanks to them, won't mention that, and we have to come together in order to protect Australian citizens? And I start thinking, that's funny. It's like being beaten up by a narcissist and you think, oh, don't beat me again. You say, don't worry, we'll look after you this time. And you think, where have I heard that before? Didn't you say that last election? I seem to keep getting the same result. But politicians, they always go back on their promises, and you think, well, then why do I have to vote for them? I'll vote for the minor parties this time. And I don't know what your thoughts are on that, Martin, but it's almost getting a little bit comical, isn't it?
Well, so there's a whole bunch of stuff to unpack there. Look, the first point I'd like to make is that in Australia now, today, we actually have a number of people who can't feed themselves adequately and can't clothe themselves adequately, and their kids, right? Even today. And we have people who are using food banks to get by. Now, those are hardly ever reported in the mainstream media, but the numbers are growing. And in fact, I was talking to someone the other day who's involved in this sector, and they've never had such heavy demands on them for those basic services. And that's partly because the government services at the state and federal level are being debilitated and removed, and partly just the pure number of more people needing help. And the conclusion when I was talking to this individual was that it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Now, some of those people were actually on the, on effectively government support to try and find another job, and we know that those are very low numbers. But a lot of people were actually in full-time work, but were still too poor to clothe themselves and feed themselves adequately. And as going to the dentist, for example, and getting dental treatment, forget it. Right. So there is a poverty problem in Australia at the moment.
I agree with what you're saying there, Martin, because Father Bob Maguire I've actually done a little bit of filming for him, and he's been doing exactly that. He's been actually going out and supporting people who need support, and really, I mean, I think people are not earning enough money to go above the poverty. Not everybody, but there's a percentage that fall below the poverty line with full-time work.
It's the working poor, or whatever you want to call it, and quite often they're in fragmented part-time work, 0 hours contracts, all of those things. So that's a really important issue. I really haven't heard much other than high-level platitudes from the Labour Party on that issue. The second issue I want to highlight is that we have these large corporations in Australia, or based in Australia, or in some cases, listed here and listed elsewhere. Some of those resources companies, but a lot of the dividends don't stay in Australia. A lot of the dividends go off to offshore investors because they're actually quite heavily invested in by overseas people. So those organisations that appear potentially to be good for Australia, and if you look at the quantum of the exports that they make, the bottom line is a lot of that goes out the country, right?
Yep.
And a lot of those very same organisations are also receiving massive subsidies from government, whether it's cheap diesel or other subsidies for their particular industry sector. And of course, they have very strong lobbying powers, and they have very strong connections with particularly Canberra, which means that essentially that top end of town is doing very well, but it doesn't actually, you asked the question, why doesn't it trickle down? The reason it doesn't trickle down is because most of it goes back offshore again, right? And that is something which is quite shameful. The tax take from those sorts of organisations are way too low, and therefore the policy of looking to deal with that is an important one. If you think about the demographic shifts that we've got in Australia at the moment, we've actually got a problem insofar that we've got more older people who are potentially working or working less or moving into retirement, and the demographic bubble has now moved into that group. Now, a lot of those people will perhaps be wanting to vote in a particular way at this election, so maybe not surprising that some parties are actually trying to position to be more supportive to elderly people. But there is a fundamental demographic problem we have in the country, which means we haven't got enough younger people to basically generate the momentum in the economy to be able to support the growth in the broader economy. The reason that's important is that if you look at the growth of industries, the ones that the industries are growing are aged care and other personal care services and those things. Those are effectively critical services, but they're not actually value creating in their own right. They are effectively an outcome of the rest of the community wanting to do the right thing, but it doesn't actually create a momentum to create more value for the broader economy. And at the moment, I don't see any conversations from either main party as to how to address this demographic shift, and a bit of conversation about training possibly, but it's pretty limited. That is a really big issue. And
I agree.
If you look at some other countries like Japan, one of the reasons why Japan is really struggling is because their demographic shift is even more advanced than ours. And it's interesting that even in China, they've got precisely the same problem. One of the reasons why their economy is beginning to slow down is, again, this demographic shift. So there are some big mega trends that need to be in play. But again, I don't believe that much of the...
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but if they're printing money, which we both know they are, internationally, I can't see... I only see that as weakening that demographic, the ability to actually, for an economy to support that. It's becoming harder because you've got weakening purchasing power.
Yep.
Incomes that aren't keeping up to inflation, and that's even their inflation they're not keeping up to, let alone the real inflation figures. I just can't see how you can drive an economy into that position. It's like they pushed it into a weak spot and said, right, what we're going to do is we're going to make all the poor people pay as much as possible in terms of taxes. We're going to reduce their purchasing power. We're going to make sure that their incomes don't grow. And then we're going to get them to pay tax to subsidise large industries that can come in and have an all-you-can-eat buffet. It's like, come and get it. You get the triangle out and start multinationals everywhere. Come and get all you can eat. No tax. We'll pay you to come and don't worry, those slaves in Australia, they'll pay more tax to help support you because they need you to come into this country to help them. Excuse me, but I wouldn't mind a model where I could kind of walk into Parliament and say, now that the elections are over, and those poor slobs have actually voted for whichever one of your parties is going to get in, which I'm going to benefit from. Now, can we get down to business? We need a national trade agreement. Let's say a G7 or a G20, and let's go and have cocktails and have a talk to Klaus Schwab. He's got the right ideas. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy. It's going to be fantastic. It's like a circus. What do you think, Martin?
Well, it is concerning insofar that the concept of what Shah was talking about and some of the other articles from the World Economic Forum is that, maybe you don't need to own anything because basically, digital allows you to just get what you want when you want it. So if you want a frying pan, you can get a frying pan and use it, but it's not your own. I mean, that is part of what they're saying, but you can take it more broadly and say, well, actually, what about property? Maybe you shouldn't own property. Maybe you should just rent it, or and if you have a 50-year mortgage, is it really the difference of renting? Well, maybe it's a bit the same. What you're starting to see, and we've had this conversation I think too before, is you're turning everyone into cash flows, and what they want you to do is go on paying forever and ever and ever. Yep. And it doesn't matter that you don't own it, because you can have your cash flow, which means that subscription service, whether it's to Netflix, whether it's to the car or the house or whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. So this whole concept of a subscription world is actually what's underpinning this, right? And I'll make the point then is, if you then start overlaying a couple of other concepts, one is a central bank digital currency and the other is information control, you can start seeing a world order that effectively is where if you dance the right tune and do the right things and your central bank digital currency works, you can go on paying those subscriptions and everything will be fine, right? Mm-hmm. You can still find somewhere to live and you can still go to work, etc. But if somebody decides that you're not quite kosher and you haven't quite done the right thing and you give you a black mark against your name and the information on this particular transaction set says, suddenly you're disenfranchised and suddenly you won't be able to effectively use those products and services and you won't be able to actually continue to thrive and survive.
Now we're getting into the controversial stuff now.
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure that is that controversial because it's already happening in China, right?
It is happening in China, but what people are not realising is how it's slowly creeping in with QR codes and health passports. Might seem like a minor thing at the moment, but let's face it, I mean, that is kind of heading towards the Chinese model. The problem is, okay, sounds great. Why don't we try it? If we try it, it's going to be on a national model or maybe international model. Now, what if I decide I don't really want to be partaking in this model? Where's that going to leave me? Or my neighbour might not. I'm not just thinking about myself. I'm also thinking, well, my neighbour might not like this. Yep. Some people think it's a fantastic idea. But the problem, I suppose, is once you create a monopoly, and I'm thinking of an international monopoly, with a one world currency, with that system in place, you don't really have anywhere to go anymore, do you? Because now you're totally reliant on the system. Now you've become a number. Now the government looks at your behaviour. And I've put videos up. I went to Canberra and there was probably, I could say probably close to 1 million people that turned up in February to the protests. ABC, of course, came along and gave us a nice review of the protests and said, there must have been at least 10,000 people here. Well, I've got aerial views showing this huge crowd. It looks a lot more than 10,000 people, folks, I got to tell you. Funnily enough, I did some interviews. I did 2 videos for the protest. One was a music video with just pictures. The other one was just interviews. And all I did was I asked each person, I said, look, tell me your name, tell me why you're here, tell me how you've been affected. And so many of the people who turned up to that protest, many of them had lost homes, businesses, couldn't work. They'd seen situations in family with health, etc. Of course, all I was doing was just repeating what they said. Within 5 minutes of posting it on YouTube, I get a message not appropriate for public viewing or not meeting community standards. And I'm thinking, did the community decide on this or did somebody decide on behalf of the community? When the ABC did a story on this, I watched the ABC and what did I see? I saw the ABC present the story, show a few pictures. on the ground. I've got aerial views with the drone on the ground, and you think, oh, well, it's hard to tell how many are there, but 10,000, okay. Of course, then they brought in their experts and they studied the psychology of the protesters and how there were extremists coming in and influencing the protesters. Well, that wasn't what I saw. I just saw people actually telling their stories, and they didn't seem to be extremist at all. Actually, they were very sad. This is where the media is getting involved, and of course the media are giving lots of coverage for the mainstream parties. Although Albanese kind of put his foot in it the other day when they asked him about the unemployment rate. And he says 5.2%. Oh, no, maybe it's not 5. And he's standing there, I'm thinking, did anybody teach this man anything about media training? If it had been me, I would have said something like, well, I think it's around 5.2%. Don't hold me to that. I can check and get back to you. But right now I've got a campaign to run, and we will be fixing the unemployment situation. Don't sound like I've done media training, don't I, Martin?
Well, did you see Adam Bandt's response? Similar question on the press club, and he said, "You should go and Google it." Which I thought was a very good response.
Now, that's an interesting point. It's funny, you've got mainstream media, which is TV, radio, newspapers. They're the common ones. Then you've got all the other mainstream media, which is Google, which is YouTube, and which is Facebook. Funnily enough, these media outlets seem to have a very similar voice. There doesn't seem to be a lot of contradiction between them. They seem to kind of say the same thing. All I'm going to say to the viewers is, I don't have a problem with people wanting to believe something. At least check it yourself. Go out and do your own research. Do what Martin does. He does his own research. He takes statistics. He comes up with figures, and he can back them up. He doesn't go to Google to say, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll take a shortcut. I won't do all the work. I'll just go to Google and type in whatever they say. The real reason people come to you, Martin, is because you do the work. You do the research. You take that extra step. You don't take what the media tell you for gospel. And for God's sake, who's going to ever take a politician's word for gospel? I mean, come on. I can just see it. Did he say what he just said? I don't believe a word of it.
The sort of point, and then we're sort of heading towards the end of the conversation. It seems to me that there is this political game going on between the two parties, right? And they're throwing rocks at each other, and they're trying to, take skin off each other's knees and what have you. But actually, it's not really creating any positivity in terms of a future trajectory for Australia. They're not addressing the critical issues that they should be addressing. There's no vision. There's no sense of where we will be in 10 years' time as a society, as a community, all of those things. And they're basically just perpetuating the status quo, which in the last 20 to 30 years has pretty much led us down this blind alley.
That's right.
And neither side of politics wants to actually, one, recognise where we are, and two, recognise that we need to do things differently to be able to actually create a more appropriate future for ordinary Australians. Now, that's my problem. And so the question I've got is, the media will give a particular lens through which everything is being presented. Quite right, as you say, it's a very partial lens. It's a very particular lens. It doesn't give the full story. Minor parties can't get a look in. Many of them can't even get onto mainstream media at all, and yet have very valid, alternative views and alternative opinions.
Yep.
So it's very hard for people to try and actually make up their own mind about what's going on. And so to an extent, people are going to actually get suckered into just doing what they've always done, which is pick one, pick the other. Which one do I hate the least? Right?
What a way to vote for a party. Which one do I hate the least? Because they know they don't have a voice. That's why.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And then I just want to come back to the other point that I made, was that the battleground is not the whole of Australia. The battlegrounds are 8 or 10 or 12 seats across the country, right?
Yep.
And so that's why, in Baz in Tasmania, for example, a seat which is potentially quite marginal, that's where they're going to throw all the money, and that's where they're going to throw a lot of time. So actually there's a great disrespect going on for the bulk of Australians who are not in those marginal seats. They're not getting all the action, right? And I think that's a real disgraceful thing. And the final point to make is that if you are basically within politics and just propagating the status quo, and you are basically following the neoliberal line of argument and following, Treasury's guidance and the RBA's guidance was a particular structural way about the economy works, which is debt-driven and all the other things we've been speaking about, right? What you're doing is you're guaranteeing a perpetuation of precisely the same models that we've had for another 5, 8, 12, whatever the number of years, right? Because the question you've got to ask yourself is, has the last 20 or 30 years actually taken us to a better place as a country or not? Has it actually laid the foundations for a better future or not? And if the answer to that is no, then the natural conclusion is you can't just do the same thing again. You can't just make the same vote as last time. You need to think about it differently, right? Because the whole point of this democratic process, if it is there to be any purpose at all, is to have a voice that makes a difference, rather than just necessarily perpetuating the status quo on the assumption that, well, it's all right, as long as you don't rock the boat too much, we'll just go on doing the same stuff again. The same stuff has led us into this cul-de-sac. The same stuff has not created the potential release of momentum that could have been made. It's locked itself into this debt-ridden structure that we're in, and with that sort of shadow of this control coming over the top and the digital coming over the top. So this is a really critical election, right? But the question is, people need to be able to actually really peel back the onion and ask more serious questions, not just those that are actually presented on the TV, not just through those major stream press conferences every day where they pick an issue and then throw it out there because it's basically 2% of the total thing, right? There has to be a better way. And so I guess what the rabbit hole conversation today is to say there has to be a better way, and there can be a better way.
So, Martin, look, I think the problem with our democratic system is that it seems to have the electorate that vote in a government that determines which way the country is going to go, that the electorate is not consulted. The lobbyists come in and they sit down with government and they say, okay, we want to privatise the profits and socialise the debt. Leave the electorate to pay all of the debt, to subsidise our companies, and then we can walk out of the country tax-free. We benefit, and if they don't support us, well, we might not come into the country and take the resources and help enrich the country. So yes, we have a great GDP, we have a rich country, but we have policies that are designed to push against small business and the working people of the country. They lose out while the neoliberal model takes over. Of course, all the policies are done in secrecy, and well, often done in secrecy, not all of them. And look, we've got the World Health Organization, we've got the vaccine rollouts. There's no transparency in what's in the vaccines. We're told they're safe and effective. And who tells us they're safe and effective? A politician tells us that they're safe and effective. I don't think they've got a particularly good record of necessarily keeping to their word. So I get very nervous when a politician starts telling me what's good for me, because their record's not particularly good. And I think that what is happening here is that the public are starting to question the politicians. They're starting to question the media. And they're coming to alternatives to find out information, because if the media and the politicians are not giving it to them, then they start to come to shows like, I know a really good one. It's called Digital Finance Analytics. It's a great show. You get the point, don't you, Martin? What do you think?
Well, it's quite clear to me that people are asking harder questions and looking for alternative perspectives. And like I said earlier on, the fact is a lot of people I would suggest are looking to the least worst option in terms of voting, rather than actually somebody they really believe in or somebody they want to get behind. So it's the least worst. Plus, of course, people's hip nerve, wallet pocket, right, is also there in the picture too. You know, how am I going to be beneficial or better off under this or that particular set of policies? Although actually at the moment there's hardly any gap between the two. So, I mean, even things like the current government's support mechanisms, you know, well, very short-term support, you know, a little bit of help with petrol for a short period of time, and a little bit of tax manipulation for but next year it's going away. So that's not real. It's just a bit of a bribe, really. And I think people are beginning to see through some of that. So to the extent that we're able to not tell people what to think, but actually perhaps ask some additional questions that help people to actually toss the ideas around and perhaps think about things differently, and perhaps question some of the things that they've assumed to be right. That is a very important role, and I'll go on doing that. That's what DFA is about.
Look, I agree. I think that you and I have actually discussed some of the possibilities of changing the tax system to try and improve the balance of payments. And there's a lot of things that governments can do to improve people's situations. But as long as we have the RBA and we have the two-party preferred system, this game of ongoing debt, I don't think it's going to change. And I really don't see the policies changing. I think things will get progressively worse, and they have been getting progressively worse. Yep. And you think, well, if this is good economic management, it doesn't seem to show on Main Street with the mums and dads and the small businesses. And really, I mean, small business relies on the general public. So we're talking about people who actually have to work for a living and pay their bills. Now, what good is it if they can't afford to spend money and go out and buy from small business? Because as soon as you get a situation where your debt levels are too high, what do? You go into austerity.
Yep.
And you start to actually pull back on your spending, and you find things you don't spend on anymore. So you stop going out and buying takeaway, and you stop going and having coffees, and you stop buying clothes, and you stop going to the dentist, and you stop looking after yourself because you have nowhere else to go. You're not the government that can just simply say, oh, I need another $100 million. Oh, that's okay. $100 million. Enter. Oh, my God, that was... Somebody get me a fan around here. I've broken into a sweat. Do you realise I just printed $100 million? That's hard work, It's
yeah.
Did you have to pay any tax on that? Oh, we're the government. We don't pay tax.
Exactly.
That's for the lower classes to take care of, not our job. Oh, by the way, how about a pay rise while we're at it? So, all I'll say is, in this election, I will be voting for minor parties myself. And I know that they're not perfect, but what other option do we have? Do we want the same thing again? I don't want it. I'm tired, Martin.
Yeah, well, I certainly am of the view that neither major party has a positive and well thought out agenda for the future. And therefore, the only way to actually wrought change is to disenfranchise them to an extent. So therefore, the minor parties have to have a critical role to play at this election. And so my own sense is that the minor parties will play an important role. How that plays out, not sure. But neither of the major parties, in my view, has earned the right to govern in their own right, because neither party, neither the one in government now or the previous set, have actually done the right thing for the majority of Australians. Shame on them. Mm-hmm. So we need a different approach. So that's where I'm sort of settling at the moment. But we'll see. Well, there's 5 weeks to go.
I can make one recommendation for the viewers, and I would recommend for all Australians should do this. It's time to become a little bit more politically active and not sit back and say, she'll be right, mate, because things are not right, and it's time to actually start talking to your members and to start telling them what you think it needs to be done. And I think this show is certainly going to help people, because we're asking the very questions that are probably on their minds, and the mainstream media are not coming to the fore to kind of help with that. So that's why Down the Rabbit Hole was created, because I wanted to make sure that with somebody with an academic background and a philosophical background, and somebody without an academic background but still has a philosophical mind. And isn't it funny how both of us seem to come to very similar conclusions? And yet I didn't become an academic, but it became quite obvious once you ask the right questions, if you're prepared to do the research. And not just listen to all the noise that's coming off the television and the politicians and and even people around you, because a lot of people around us, let's face it, Martin, they don't do the research, and they really have preconceived ideas on how things work. very hard to kind of convince a person who just has this focused, preconceived idea that everything's going to be fine. And as long as they're okay, like I find people who are on good incomes, they don't particularly care if the rest of the economy is going down. And you mentioned when we bounced back up through the budget, we had a K-shaped recovery. Remember that?
Yeah.
And this is exactly what you were talking about. There are people who are suffering.
Yep.
There are also people who are doing very, very well.
Yep.
But the people who are suffering are saying, well, it doesn't seem to matter what happens. We just keep going down. And if they've gone and borrowed all this money, who's going to pay for it? Well, I'm sorry to say it, but you are. You're going to pay for it, and so is the future generations. And you sit there and you think, it doesn't seem right to me. So I think this election, I would strongly suggest to people who are going to cast their votes for maybe, if they haven't thought about it already, to start thinking about, well, if they want to vote for the party, a major party, at least question the party and start telling them what they want from that party. Otherwise, go to the other minor parties and start asking them what their policies are. And also they can suggest to them ideas. I think you and I have that 1% transaction tax would certainly cast a wide net and would not necessarily solve all the problems, but it would be a start. But the beauty of it is, I suppose, we could get rid of all the other taxes. Am I correct, Martin?
Well, certainly the transaction tax idea is one that I think has merit. And, of course, the neoliberals would hate it and all the bankers would hate it, but never mind.
That seems like a good thing to me.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's probably a good reason for thinking about it hard.
Yes.
Look, I'm not going to push people in a particular way. Well, I guess, the closing thoughts are, this is an important election, right? Yep. It's probably one of the most important elections we've had in a generation. And what you do and how you go about making your choices will determine a lot of things. But it is important to go through the process and spend a bit of time and think about it, rather than just following what you've always done without really thinking about it, or just taking the first blush, high-level message from the media or whatever, and just say, "Oh, that'll be fine then." I think at the moment it's worth actually spending time to think about it, and just think about how your democratic right is actually going to be protected, and how you exert your influence on where things may go. George, I really appreciate your time. It's been great to catch up again, and I'm sure we'll go down the rabbit hole again in the next few weeks. There's plenty else we can talk about.
Well, I think the media is still something that both you and I should probably look at.
Yeah, we should do a separate show on the media. There's a lot we could talk about there.
And as I worked in it, but I mean, standing back and looking at it, and did you work in the media yourself?
I've always worked in and been very close to the media. I've always had an interest in how the news is made, quote unquote. Right?
Oh, I've seen it being made. I've worked right in the heart of it, so I know. Yeah. When we do the one on the media, I can talk about the inner workings of the media.
Yeah, no, we should do that. George, thank you very much. Yes. Have a good evening and have a good election.
You too, Martin, and hopefully we might be able to break the chains of the two major party stronghold that we seem to have. Thank you,
later.
Martin.
Okay,
Bye.
cheers. Bye-bye.